Such what?
But I'm frozen in motion, and my head tells me to stop, feelings I feel about us. Try to fight it, but it's never enough. My heart is hurting, it's more than a crush, cause I'm frozen in motion, and my head tells me to stop, but my heart goes. Cause my heart goes.
Bear with us, everybody. It seems like Prof Diaz is maybe having some technical difficulties. We'll get there. Hope you had a good week. You're almost done. While that's getting sorted out, I might as well make this announcement. There are some of you that didn't get certain recapture assignments in. I'll remind you that those are free points as long as you kind of do your best on those assignments. And I'll extend the following offer, which is that if you look back and there are recapture assignments you didn't get in, and you're staring at your grade right now, and you calculating your grade, or maybe you came to talk to me and asked about your grade, and you wished it were a little higher. One way to do that would be to turn those recapture assignments in. I cannot give you full credit for a late assignment, but I can give you something. And if you do that, let me know.
Why am I not the host? Sorry, my computer's having a huge issues. It just crashed, so I had to like restart. And right now it's not letting me share screen. Okay, thank you. Okay. Let's see. So I don't have office hours today specifically, but if anyone wanted to meet with me, you can talk to me after class or send me an email and we can talk about it. So everyone, your quiz grades are officially up on Moodle, so feel free to check those. But I will put up, we'll have recapture. So we have recapture that I'll set up for next week. And then we also have next Wednesday is supposed to be the next quiz. So I've already put up a study guide for that. I will once again have during my office hours a review session. But yeah, you know, chugging along. Do you have any questions about that, concerns or anything? No. Okay.
Professor Diaz?
Yep.
I still can't see the grade for the Unit 4 quiz.
Neither can I.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. I will, I guess maybe I just, all right. I figured when it was fully graded, it would show it to you, but okay, I'll change the permissions, I guess, to make it show it up. Sorry about that. Weird. Let's see. Okay, I will add that to my list of things to do. Sorry about that. All right, well then in that case, it will be right after class, they will be available. Sorry about that. Okay. I'll figure out those permissions. The recapture for quiz number 4 will be due next, like Friday next week. Give you a little bit more time just because apparently you can't see them anyway. So yeah. But that'll be listed online. And I'll send out an email once that's set up and your grades are available. Yeah, I guess it's not telling you, which is weird. So sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. So sorry I got a late start. Those will all be fixed for you, but let's jump on in. Today we're going to be talking about trophic levels and community interactions. So talking about the different kind of influences that organisms can have on each other, kind of categorizing their relationships, but also looking how food webs and trophic levels work together to kind of keep everything in check. Talk about how energy as well as chemicals get flooded, go through the various levels of a community of organisms. And so in ecosystems, we're talking about, again, this idea of biodiversity, the variety of species and life within an ecosystem. We if you remember last class, we were talking about those feedback loops, talking about how different species exert influence on one another. And so having a lot of biodiversity creates a more complicated food web, but it generally also makes a more stable ecosystem. So when we're looking at biodiversity, we're looking at 2 different primary things. And so you'll learn more about this if you take 108. You'll go into, we'll actually be calculating biodiversity and things like that in labs, specifically in like bacteria. But one, we're interested in the number of species and then the abundance of those species. So the number of individuals of each of those. And so obviously biodiversity is having variety in life. And so you can have an ecosystem that has an abundance of very low amount of organisms, say like 1 million krill or just a lot of cockroaches or something in an area, or a specific plant. And so that obviously can be a thriving ecosystem in its own way, but it's not going to be a very biodiverse one. And so scientists, when they're talking about biodiversity, they want to know a lot of different levels. Biodiversity is like It's like ecology in that you can look at it at a lot of different levels, right? You can look at global patterns of diversity, how organisms migrate, or how, variations in like families of organisms. So like, how do spiders in one type of climate compare to those of another? Is there more biodiversity of insects, say, in the rainforest there is compared to, say, the tundra or things like that? But really what we want to know is, how do different evolutionary processes generate diversity, and then what factors cause both uneven distributions of species and limit the distribution of species, right? So this is our continuation of looking at how different organisms affect one another and limit their different patterns. And so, in these like two examples, we have the, left and right, we have these two sets of different types of trees. There are the same number of trees in both these images, but the variety of trees is different, right? And so, up here, there's higher species evenness, right? You have, more and more of each of these types. There's a lot more diversity in tree types. You have 4 different types and they're distributed everywhere, which is creating a very biodiverse atmosphere, right? This one on the left has the same number of species as the one on the right, but there's not nearly as many of a lot of them, right? The abundance is not evenly distributed. And so this one on the right is going to be more biodiverse, right? Again, the same number of species are there, but having a plentiful amount. Only one spruce tree amongst all these ash trees isn't much biodiversity, right? It's also going to make it harder for that one species there's lower amounts of to propagate, right? And so it's not going to be as sustainable of a system. And so when we measure biodiversity, I'm not going to ask you to calculate these. I just want you to know, again, how they work in terms of this comparison of number of species to number of individuals. And so there's 2 of them. There's the Shannon index and the Simpson index. And so in both of these, what they're doing is they are generating essentially a proportion of, if you were to look at all these organisms in an environment, what are the chances as you pick out more and more of them that you're getting novel species? And so in this one, we're summing the number of individuals, so the proportion of this species. So let's say we have 500 organisms in an environment and 100 of them are of a particular species. We're going to be plugging in 100 here, and then we're going to be multiplying it, and this is taking, one of the an asymptotic curve, trying to find the number of organisms. Again, I'm not going to ask you to calculate these, but what I want you to know is that, the higher something is up. So like Shannon index ranges from 0 to 1 to 4.5. The Simpson index ranges from 0 to 1. And so if you're close to 4.5 or you're close to 1, that means you have a very high level of biodiversity in your population. And so that's just how scientists do it. I'm not going to ask you to do that. But Simpson index calculates the percentage of chance you pick a random organism out. And so there are both positive and negative relationships that organisms can have in these different food webs. And so I'm just going to talk about some of these impeding interactions and how they affect organisms. So, for instance, this one is pretty straightforward. Competition, right? There's interaction between organisms who both need to have access to a limited resource, right? There's, they could be sharing. Yeah, they could be sharing, they could be fighting for water, they could be fighting for territory, they could even be fighting for mates. And so this is when 1 or 2 organisms are both harmed through physical injury or access to limited supply of one resource. So this is, again, physical confrontation, so males competing with one another for, say, a mate, or it could be simply limited access, right? So you have predation, the predator, you have one organism that kills and consumes the other, generally for food, but in this case for sport. And so you can have herbivory and carnivory, which we already know, right? Eating plants or eating animals, and that'll affect where you are in a food web, and obviously what will eat you. And so having different levels of competition can change the niche of organisms, right? An organism that is being preyed upon in one environment is going to be living a very different lifestyle than, say, you remember those cute little marsupials we were talking about in Australia that have no natural predators, right? Um, Predation is what is limiting their distribution, right? They're getting eaten outside of these safe areas, and so they're kind of staying into their niche. Um, but since organisms need to share supplies of food, they usually need to move. And so in this image, we're looking at two protists and growing these two colonies within the same petri dish. And so, if you look at the one on top, you're looking at these two organisms being grown separately, right? So as they're being grown, they're increasing, they're doing some type of almost exponential growth. Then they start hitting the capacity of their environment, and then they start to asymptote off. And so both of these organisms are doing that same behavior. But once you include competition into this, both of these organisms cannot fully thrive, right? So when you're growing these together, you can see that this red organism is actually out competing the other. For some reason, it could have a better defense mechanism, it could have a faster way of allocating resources. But either way, once these are grown together, this second organism is no longer able to exponentially grow. In fact, before they even hit that level, they start to die out. And so, this can happen for a lot of reasons. It could, again, be predator-prey relationships, or it could just be competing over a resource. But in either case, both organisms are going to be hampered. Neither of them are growing to their optimum growth paths because of the shared resources that they have to go through. And so, again, it's limiting nutrients. Limited nutrients in caves, limited sunlight, limiting water. And so one of the most extreme examples of this type of competition is the idea of invasive species. Your textbook in the newest version also refers to them as introduced species. But invasive species are a massive problem around the world due to trade and due to the fact that we travel everywhere. We accidentally release pets. We on purpose release pets. People travel by boat and carry fish and other organisms with them. And so invasive species are an intense form of competition, and I like to think of them as a very good example of natural selection at work. And we're not talking about that very much, but invasive species are those that are transplanted from one location to another. And when that happens, they're allowed to thrive. And so some classic examples of organisms like this, we have snakehead fish. I'm going to use the cane toad as my personal example, but Australia is overrun with these organisms. You then have constrictor snakes, which is another pet issue that I was talking about. In certain parts of the world, people like having snakes. Those snakes get too big. They then release these pythons and constrictor snakes into the wild. They have absolutely no natural predators, and they're able to just thrive, especially an organism like a snake that's like a top predator. But then even things like zebra mussels, barnacles, things that are sticking to a boat that you can't necessarily always clean or know about, those organisms can move into a new environment and do much better than the local organisms. So generally speaking, invasive species are negative because they drive out local species and often lead to extinction, not necessarily even just of organisms they're competing with, but other organisms in so this I'm going to show a video about the cane toad in Australia, and like they have kind of they have conservationists who go out and are trying to remove them, but they're so endemic in the population and they reproduce so quickly that it honestly might be impossible, especially because they share a close environmental niche with other organisms. So I'll get into that. But yeah, so these species drive them to extinction, and the reason that is because usually they have no natural predators. So, for instance, there may be no organisms that recognize they can eat them. So they're like, none of these predators know about the cane toad, or they don't know that they are supposed to eat it, or in the example of the cane toad, actually, they have a better defense than the local species. So these frogs are highly toxic, and so a lot of organisms that try to eat them, snakes and other carnivores, will actually die in the process of eating a cane toad. And so having some type of better defense or better way of allocating resources allows them to outcompete. And so they drastically change food webs in their environment. They're extreme competition that drive out other organisms. And so predators can't eat them, and so they force organisms out of the same niche. So for instance, anything that's eating what the cane toad's eating is now going to be competing for that resource. But those organisms are also going to be eaten in the process, whereas the cane toad is not. And so this is just a simple infographic looking at alien species, what they're calling, but invasive species throughout the world. And you can see that the most invasive species are occurring along the coasts, and are occurring through trade routes, right? So the funny but interesting thing is, like, there's actually invasive species that we're trading with other organisms, other countries. So for instance, you know Japan actually has a really bad, in their rice paddies, they have an endemic level of crawfish. So human Americans or some other foreign agency which had crawfish actually brought them over, accidentally released them in the wild. And so crawfish, when I was doing my experiments in Japan in grad school, I could see the crawfish living in the water of the rice paddies, just like floating there. And so nothing knows to eat them. But we've also, Japan has also given us several species of big mouth bass that are now, or carp, I forgot, but they're endemic to, this western coast of America. And so, it's not one species rules all. It's, the fact that they don't have any natural checks in their environment, right? So they're just being passed around. And so what is endemic in one area may not necessarily be endemic in another. And that's a general issue, with these species. And so, what happened with the cane toad is a really sad experiment that scientists tried to do, or ecologists tried to do. And so what happened is that this is the cane beetle, which is a beetle that was eating a lot of sugar cane and actually causing a massive issue with production of the sugarcane and the plantations. And so what they did is, in 1935, they said, all right, we have cane beetles, let's release cane toads, and let's hope these cane toads eat the beetles, and then we can have a natural way of protecting our sugarcane plantations. The problem is that, not only did they not eat the cane toads in a large enough supply, they really didn't eat those cane beetles at all. And so the cane toads not only didn't solve their problem, but since they don't have any natural predators, they started to multiply. And now there are millions and millions of cane toads there. And so they actually have an area on their back that release of super strong neurotoxin. And so these cane toads can actually get swallowed by like snakes or other animals, and they will actually die in the mouth of that, or the snake will die with the cane toad in its mouth, and the cane toad will actually probably be able to hop away. All right, let's open this. All right, let's do that. All right, so this is going to be a Nat Geo video first. They're very dramatic, and then we're going to move on to a more nature conservation one. But let's do this. Closed captioning on.
One bite can release a deadly defensive venom. Spread under his warty skin and concentrated in 2 glands on his back is a toxic cocktail of poisons, potent enough to kill a crocodile. The local toughs are in trouble. This isn't a fair fight.
hasn't come alone. He runs with a gang, an enormous gang. It numbers in the millions. Since their arrival in 1935, these ecological terrorists have been charging forward in massive numbers. In just 70 years, they have pillaged their way through the outback, gobbling all they come across. They've turfed out the natives and turned nearly 400,000 square miles of Australia into occupied territory.
And so this is going to show people dealing with them, and you'll see how numerous they are.
Comes knocking. Bang goes the neighborhood. Each toad contains enough venom to kill a small child. It's deadly if swallowed, though the venom can't penetrate human skin. But Bufo's mere presence is enough to dismay most residents.
On any given evening, you'd probably have 30 or 40 toads in and around the restaurant, with another 50 or so under the floodlights outside.
The Aussies haven't taken to their new neighbors.
The cane toad's by far the worst thing that's happened, no doubt about it.
2 minutes of cane toad catching.
Nah, I hate the little buggers.
They're just dirty things. Cane toads are just so dirty. I hate them. I hate them.
There's tens of thousands of them. You can't feed them, so you've just got to accept them and live with them.
All right, so these cane toads are quickly reproducing. As they said in that video, they have no natural predators, and so the other problem is you can't put, say, some type of toxin or some type of thing to attack the cane toads, because they're amphibians. Anything that you're going to do is most likely going to affect other amphibian species as well as other reptile species and other organisms in the environment. And so the cleanest way that scientists do is they have to go out and physically catch these. And so
experts believe it's the only option.
Yeah. And so what they have to do is they have to capture cane toads, and then they humanely put them down in order to try to, curb the population a little bit. But the problem is that they've reproduced so fast. There are so many millions producing millions. And as they said, not only are they affecting the higher up food chains, such as these carnivores, but they're also affecting fish. They're fishing and affecting all of these small organisms in aquatic environments as well. And so they're leading to massive issues in that area. Let's see next. All right, so obviously, there are negative things that can happen with organisms, but there can also be positive ones, right? So we're going to be talking about those in a second. So actually, that was something I was thinking about giving to y'all. So here's talking about these genetically engineered mosquitoes. And so there's actually, they just, where is it? I think it's in Florida. They just said that they're able to do this. So they send out males who attract females, and then they have a certain gene that makes it, it doesn't make them infertile. It makes it so that female mosquitoes don't develop. They have like a toxic gene in them that builds up as the embryo tries to develop, and then it kills the female mosquito. So only males are born. And so there's no way to like propagate those species. And they're trying to target those, which is pretty cool.
That's a gene drive, and that's what the New Yorker article sort of addresses. And there are moral questions or ethical questions around that, because for the same reason that the cane toad experiment went wrong, gene drive experiments could also go wrong. So we're not sure yet.
That is my concern. I was reading the government paper of ecological impact of it, and they were saying that it's very species specific, but like it is you know, and that they were saying that most of these environments, that mosquitoes don't make up a substantial portion of any one organism's diet, and so it shouldn't theoretically infect it. But like gene transfer, species mating, I don't know, there could be a lot of things. It does concern me. So that makes sense. So on to symbiosis. So in enhancing interactions, right? Organisms can be so closely interacting that they actually require one another to survive. Their niches are tied completely to one another. And so this requires them to share resources and provide service to one another to both survive. These can be very complicated because there are levels of symbiosis where organisms can exist in an environment without one another. They just enhance each other to a point where it helps. But there are also symbiotic relationships to the point where one will die without the other. Essentially, one is completely incapable of, has to require the other in order to exist. So, there are different levels of this. So there's like mutualism, where, symbiosis that's beneficial for both organisms. And then there's this commensalism, which is an association between organisms that, benefits one. So again, an organism, say, that's living off another, but it doesn't necessarily harm the other organisms. So classic symbiotic relationships would be, like Nemo and sea anemones, right? Clownfish are living in sea anemones. They are providing food by like cleaning themselves on the anemones. The anemones themselves are getting food by eating and cleaning the clownfish. And then the clownfish also has a stinging, very painful home to live in that stops other organisms. Unfortunately, I'm going a little slow because the class ended late, so I'm not going to play this video, but this is super interesting and I think you should look at it. It's an example of extreme symbiosis between what is known as an acacia plant and an acacia ant. And so an acacia plant is a plant that produces little fruit bodies all over them. And then they have a specific species of ant that likes to live in them. And so the ant lives inside the plant and then feeds off of these fruiting bodies that they produce. And in exchange, the ant attacks and tries to kill anything that affects the plant. So if a vine tries to grow on the plant, the ants will cut it down. If a grasshopper tries to eat the plant, ants will swarm them. And the cool thing about this is not only are there this symbiotic relationship, but the only species of vegetarian spider actually also lives on these trees. So the vegetarian jumping spider competes and tries to steal these fruit bodies from the ants, and then they parkour around the plant to get away from the ants. So you should watch that video. It's pretty cool. But what I want to get into while there's still time is the idea, again, these impeding interactions, all of these have to do with food webs, right? And so there are food webs, and then there are, food chains. And so when we analyze systems, we talk about trophic levels, or we organize these food webs into predator-prey interactions and niches. Because what we want to do is we want to look at how energy is flowing through these systems. And by knowing how energy is flowing, we can also know how chemicals and other things are flowing. It also allows us to map out relations between organisms and figure out, what organisms are vital for an environment and what role they each play in that. And so one nice thing is, obviously we love biodiversity and we want lots of organisms to be there. We want to see as many beautiful different animals as possible. But, the classic, like, oh, if that organism leaves, like the whole food web is destroyed, is often not true, simply because most of the time there are many species who fill similar niches. So for instance, this eagle is going to be able to eat other birds, other frogs, and rats. Removing of a rat might make this system more, overall unstable, or it might change the proportion of these organisms. But if you were to say, just remove this rat, all of these higher level predators are still going to be able to eat. And so it's important to know these interactions for that reason. Especially say with the cane toad, if we're taking out, the cane toad, are there any other organisms like frogs in that same area that we might be killing? And so it's going to be very difficult. And so it allows us to learn which species are vital for survival of or for others. It raises a lot of scientific questions, hypotheses of how organisms are related to one another. But really, we're talking about the flow of energy through the ecosystem. And so when we talk about a food web, it's an entire ecosystem and how those organisms relate to one another. And then a food chain is a single path going from the primary producer, which is going to be a plant, to the apex predators. And I'll talk about how we label these things. And so a food chain, you have a primary producer, which is, as it sounds, a producer. So an organism that is making its own food. So those could be, chlorophyll filled, protists. Those could be plants, but they're producing the energy. And so this is, again, how plants limit what happens in an environment, right? They're producing all the energy that's going into the system. You then have levels of consumer after that. So primary consumer are the herbivores or omnivores who are eating those plants. Secondary consumers are eating herbivores. Secondary consumers can be both omnivores and carnivores, but generally you start getting to the carnivore territory. Tertiary consumers and quaternary consumers, or in this case, apex predators. And so as you go up this, you can add as many links as there are. Usually these links break down after 20, but the idea is that you can follow the energy being produced by a plant, and you can follow it going up onto an eagle. And so primary producers are lowest on the food chains because they create their own energy from the sun, and then consumers are carnivores or herbivores. And again, multiple organisms can hold the same niche. There can be multiple tertiary consumers in an environment. And so one thing that you need to know, that you've probably noticed, but maybe didn't have a reason for, is that if you look at, as you go up a food chain, there are less and less organisms that can be sustained at that level. So for instance, there's a lot more grass than there are rabbits, and there are more rabbits than there are snakes, and more snakes than eagles. And so the reason that happens is for a number of things. First and foremost, if there's too many of, say, an apex predator of eagles, it's going to be the same issue with those deer, right? They're going to eat themselves to death. They're going to eat everything below them. If you have too many people consuming at the top, it's going to take all the resources from the bottom. But there's also an energy reason that this occurs, and that is what we know is the 10% rule. So if you remember, we're talking about nutrients, we're talking about metabolism, right? Animals are innately losing energy in heat and metabolic processes. So all of the energy that's coming from the sun that enters, say, a particular blade of grass is not transferable to the higher levels. That same concentration is not going to be going to exist going up to the eagle. And that's because there's a loss of energy between each of these levels. And so it's estimated, it depends on the environment and the organism. Certain organisms are better acclimated for transferring energy, but usually it's about 10%. And so usually when you look at populations, the amount of each trophic level, so let's say primary consumers of rabbits, is going to be roughly a tenth that of the level below it. So if you have 10,000 kilocalories of energy produced of grass, you're going to have about 1,000 kilocalories of rabbits. And so as you go along, you're dividing by 10 the amount of energy that is available at that level, because it's only about 10% is stored in flesh. And so there's inefficiency of energy transfer along the chain. There's energy loss due to incomplete digestion, especially at higher trophic levels. There are organisms, right, like flies, who eat poop, right? There's always energy left in poop. There's always nutrients. And so there are organisms who take advantage of that. But again, that's energy that's not in the eagle. And so if something eats an eagle, it's not going to get that energy either, right? It's losing more of it. But these can be limited. Often 10 can be up to 20 if you're in these kind of micro environments where you have organisms eating each other on that level. But point is, all due to the second level of thermodynamics. And so, as I was saying, not not all organisms are vital for an ecosystem, but some are, right? And so they can happen in various ways. They're known as keystone species. And so a keystone species is a species that's critical to the functioning of an ecosystem because it does one of two things. Often in an environment, keystone species can be um, uh, a keystone species, it can be an apex predator, right? So in this situation, we're looking at an aquatic environment, right? We have three levels. We have these arthropods that are at the bottom. So we have, crabs and shrimp, which are being eaten by rays. And then those rays are being eaten by sharks. Now, an issue we have is, overfishing of sharks. Sharks have a very long gestation period. They carry their babies in their stomach. They only have a few pups with each litter. They take years to reach sexual maturity. So as we hunt them, we got less and less. And so what happens is if you remove those sharks, we go right back into that deer scenario. Once you cull all the sharks, there's no longer sharks to eat the rays. The rays then are going to overeat those arthropods on the bottom, and they're going to deplenish their food supply. And so what's going to happen is this is probably going to collapse, right? You're going to have the keystone species, that apex predator gone. These rays are going to eat everything below them, and then there's not going to be this food web. And to answer your question, Hannah, no, not all keystone species are predators. I think the most apparent ones, and a lot of the good examples are apex predators, but it could be, think of it in the reverse way, right? You could have, say, a species of crab that's being eaten specifically by these rays. And so if, say, that species of crab goes extinct, those rays will go extinct, and then the shark no longer has something to eat. And so there's actually an idea of top down versus down top. And so top down is, again, that top predator. So, you remove the foxes, that become more frogs, which means there's less snails, which means there's more plants, but you're breaking up and you're having a cascading effect. But what you're asking about is a bottom up effect. So, think of it as, if all the plants in an environment died, bottom up, there's no longer that energy being put into the food web, being put into the food chain. And so by removing flowers, you're then removing snails, which are less food for the frogs, which are less food for the foxes. And so this can be very, very complicated and a lot of variables. Exactly, Professor Aiken. Exactly. It's hard to know which block is going to cause us all to fall down because you never know exactly what things are eating or exactly what subtle niches these organisms can have. And so what I'm going to talk about real quickly is the idea of biomagnification. So biomagnification is, instead of talking about how energy goes through environments, I'm going to talk about a problem we have with chemicals going through environments. Because when you eat an organism, when this frog eats a snail, it's going to eat all the toxins or all of the things that are in that organism's body, and some of it's good and some of it could be bad. And so as a classic example of this, there's a chemical we used to use in order as a pesticide called DDT. And so if you look at this chemical structure, we have these benzene rings here. They are very, very stable. So this molecule is something that's very hard to break down. And so it was a pesticide used in the 1960s, and it was thought to be harmless. When we utilized it, it seemed to affect only insect and lower level organisms, but it became known as the classic example of biomagnification. And so biomagnification is the buildup of a chemical in an environment that leads to adverse effects. What happens is as it moves up the food chain, you get higher and higher concentrations. And so a chemical that at a lower concentration was completely unharmful is now going to be affecting organisms because it's stored in their tissues. And so not only does it affect insects, but we found out that DDT could lead to birth defects in humans, in cancers. And then the big thing that really got us to notice DDT in the short term was bird populations. We were finding that birds who were eating the insects that we were trying to kill with DDT were actively dying. And so this is actually why, part of the reason why eagles were beginning to go extinct. And so what happens is that these molecules can't be broken down by a body, right? So they are some type of form that is super strong, or perhaps our body just doesn't have the proper enzymes to break it down, right? We've never dealt with this protein before, so we're not just going to evolve something, right? And so what happens is if you look at this chart on the side, it's listed as ppm. So when we measure chemicals in a solution, usually we use parts per million. So that's just, how many molecules of that particular chemical are there in a million molecules of water. Um, and so what happens is, say you put some DDT into the environment, it's floating in the water, right? You're then going to have plankton that are breathing in that water. They have their aquatic gills. They're breathing in DDT. It's starting to fill their cells because it's not being broken down. It's being incorporated into fat and tissue. But what happens is each of those plankton does not have a high amount of DDT. It's not toxic to them. But that plankton is going to be eaten by a fish. And that fish is not just going to eat one plankton, right? It's going to need to eat hundreds of those plankton every day in order to survive. And so every time it eats one of those, it's going to build up more of that DDT in its system. And so this doesn't just go up linearly. As this goes up, these trophic levels, it actually goes up exponentially. And so whereas each individual plankton only has 5 parts per million, the fish now has 200. That fish is going to get eaten by a bird. That bird, that eagle or something, is not only going to eat one fish, it's going to eat 2 fish a day for its entire life. And so that is going to further concentrate the chemical. And so now it goes from 200 to 1600. It's 8 times the amount of concentration. And so at some point in this chain, that concentration becomes concentrated enough to cause problems. And so because of this inefficiency, predators have to eat more prey to survive, and then it slowly builds up these extra toxins. And so, the food chain is damaged by lethal concentrations. And so why do we care? Well, what are we but an apex predator? We're eating tuna, right? We eat salmon. We eat all of these different types of aquatic animals and other animals. And so if they're affecting lower level lower level trophic levels, it can build up and affect us. And so that's how DDT gets us. Except, as Professor Aiken was saying, DDT was used to help malaria, to help kill mosquitoes and lice. And so there's actually videos of they would walk into a classroom of students and they would blast them with a fire hose of DDT. And it's like, no one has lice, yay. And then we realized that every time they take in DDT, they breathe it in, it's going into their fats. And so when those children grow up and try to have kids, all of a sudden we're going to have issues with development, And so in the case of DDT, what it was doing is that DDT gets ingested by eagles and it doesn't actually kill them. What it does is it actually gets incorporated into the shells of their eggs. And so it makes them extremely, extremely soft. And so it leads to premature death. So what happens is these eagles, they eat the fish, they get this DDT in their system, they lay an egg. The DDT makes their eggs brittle and soft. And so when the eagle goes to lay on their egg, they actually shatter it and they kill their baby. And so how are they supposed to reproduce? And so there are 2 different commercials here. But I just wanted to show you, this is part of why, DDT was so bad in the environment. Because not only were we, putting into the environment, but people were putting it everywhere in their house.
Pest killer is a DDT preparation. We realize what that means. Once the bug comes in contact with DDT, he's lost. All he has to do is just walk on any pesticide-treated surface. DDT is absorbed through the feet and spreads throughout the insect's entire nervous system. The effect is disastrous. DDT seems to literally drive bugs crazy. But not for long. DDT next paralyzes. Then kills.
but we're like, oh, it doesn't affect humans, so this is fine. Also, what's with the 40s and like sweet piano music over weird things?
In both its form, powder and liquid, Destroy means doomsday to us insects. For this new insect destroyer contains a lot of DDT, not just a little. Its DDT content is even higher than government specifications.
Nice.
The really sure kill feature of this insect killer isn't simply that it contains DDT, it's the way that it makes sure that bugs get the DDT that's in it.
So if you look at that slide, it'll link you to a much longer version of this commercial where they'll show it spraying on people. But yeah, people used to paint their houses with this as covering to keep out insects. We would spray people. There's actually a video, if you look it up, of us going over to Africa and trying to spray DDT over a lot of the locals and trying to take care of their malaria problem. And they really aren't having it. And it's interesting because they instinctually knew that this was going to be a bad idea. In terms of its use. And so DDT is banned in America, but you know, there are other parts of the world, like China specifically was using DDT for many years after we stopped. And so scientists believe that there's small amounts of DDT that are building up in the environment. And yeah, exactly, Sarah. She's not wearing gloves. It has higher than government specifications for DDT. You know, this was before we had the EPA, and this was before we had a lot of the restrictions on chemicals and a lot of, you know, now everything that's being created, they try to make it so that it's very species specific, or they check lethal concentrations of things throughout it. And so if you want to look at some squishy eggs, there's a video of just, you know, someone recreating and kind of showing how squishy the eggs are compared to a real one. But, you know, birds of prey had the highest concentration of DDT, right? They weaken their shells and then they would accidentally break them. And so if you look at the, and sorry, I'm going a little quickly through this. It's 11:24, so you have to go. Sorry about that for starting late. But if you look, as you know, over the course from, you know, the 40s when the 40s when the DDT was released, you know, we actually created a eagle protection plan, right? We made it illegal to kill eagles, so no more hunting, right? And yet the population of bald eagles fell for 30 years after that, even though we were trying to protect them. And so that was buildups of DDT, just ricocheting through this population. And obviously after we banned it and after a certain amount of time and use of pesticides, the population of eagles have slowly gone up. And now I don't believe they're an endangered species anymore, which is really nice. But this DDT being used in the 40s led to 30 years of death and almost 30 years of death and almost a complete removal of the population, right? And so last note, I said we talked about this before. This is Rachel Carson. If you ever want to read Silent Spring. She was actually the person who made this issue with DDT well known. So she worked as an environmental conservationist and she documented environmental problems throughout all of the 1950s. She talked to scientists, they surveyed areas with birds, they surveyed everything. And what she realized in 1962, she published a book. And so this book is kind of like social commentary. It is based in reality, but the idea of it is that it takes place in the future in which we've continued to use all these pesticides. And in that future, you know, all the birds have died from DDT, from our use of pesticides. And so spring is silent because there are no birds to sing, which is so depressing. But she wrote this book and it got a lot of national attention. And so, you know, she accused the chemical industry of spreading misinformation. So this is when we really started getting into like, are they spreading proper information? Are these chemical industries really testing their product, or do they know that they cause problems? Obviously, they just want to make a quick buck. But eventually her work and her efforts led to the banning of DDT and actually led to the creation of the EPA. And so, you know, even though, you know, for a while our EPA hasn't been doing anything, yeah, she was able to influence and actually create an entire agency of the government. So she's badass, she's awesome, and she theoretically saved, you know, a lot of lives and our, you know, species and our environment. So, you know, awesome. So that is all I have for you today on that. Sorry about going over. Again, check out some of those videos, especially the acacia tree. That one is awesome. But yeah, I will, after this class, I will post this video and I will get your grades so that they're actually shown. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Professor Diaz, or Ikin, if you have a second, I just have a question regarding 108. I could do it over email if you don't have time, but like,
yeah, sure.
So I've been talking a lot with my advisor, and long story short, just because of the way my schedule works, I won't be able to take 108 until the spring. Even if I try to be a bio major. So we were talking about possibly taking a summer course, like if I try to look somewhere over the summer. But I know that the way we split up 107 and 108 is weird, so it's hard to find another school that has the same kind of. So I was wondering if you know of any places off the top of your head that might allow for me to get a 108 credit, or if I should just wait until the spring.
Bryn, just can I jump in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why won't it work in the fall for you?
Yeah, so my correlate is German studies, and I was hoping to get my intermediate level courses out of the way sophomore year so that I could study abroad my junior year. And the only intermediate German course for the fall runs the same time as 108. And if I don't take the fall one, I can't take the spring one.
And if you don't take it in the fall, you can't go abroad?
It'll be a lot harder to find a program because I would have to find an English speaking one. Like there is options to just take 108 and try to delay my German studies, but this would also help because if I delay my bio course, next semester I'm taking physics and orgo, which both have labs. So it'd be a little less coursework for me.
Yeah.
I think that's a tough one.
Yeah, Vassar's very iffy about transfer credits.
Yeah.
Well, it's more just like, you know, I mean, you want to build your major on a solid foundation. And so like, I think like, I mean, I would express I would strongly advise you to try to get 107, 108 at Vassar. I mean, if I were your advisor, and again, your advisor, you know, can't tell you what to do and it's your decision, but I would say like, you should think about like what the priorities are and then let your priorities kind of dictate your decision making, right? I mean, if biology is going to be your major, that sort of moves it kind of higher up the priority list, and kind of letting your bio career get pushed around by a correlate is kind of maybe the cart before the horse. I guess the other thing I would say, but if you took 108 in the spring, that wouldn't be terrible. You wouldn't be too far behind the ball, right? You're a first year, right? So, you know, you'd be 107, 108 by the end of your second year. That's fine. And you're thinking of taking orgo and physics next semester?
Yes, pre-med.
Okay, so those will fulfill your intensive requirements for biology. And so then you just have, for over the next 4 semesters, junior and senior year, 3 200s and 2 300s. That's doable. I will say orgo and physics together in 1 semester, that's another sort of, for me, like potential, like that's a tough semester. Like orgo was the first class for me in college where I was like, oh crap, right? So you might just, again, think about all those things, put yourself in the best position to succeed in general, right? And that's not like specific to you, that's for all of us. Sorry, I'm just like talking over everybody, Prof. Diaz, if like you want to jump, that's like, I just had too much coffee and, but so I would consider all those factors. And we would both be happy to chat more at length about it. You can register for all of them. I know that this is like the end of the period, and see what you get, right? And then you can always trim, right, during drop, and add things. So, but I would think about that a little bit. Maybe just orgo or just physics and 108 in the spring, and you're still in great shape, right? That just, I might think about that, right? You want to, like crush orgo, feel good about it, add 108 in the spring, and then physics in your junior year. I mean, why not? You got time. Don't rush, right? If you try to sprint a marathon, it doesn't work out well, right? Athletes always look for negative splits. Start slow, finish fast.
All right. That really helps. Thank you a lot.
Okay, I had a not so class related spider question.
Sure.
Not for me.
So I am gonna be getting a few jumping spiders today, and I know that there's some labs on campus that have fruit flies, and I was gonna order my own culture, but I was wondering if you knew of any of like the professors that had fruit fly cultures that I could maybe like talk into giving me a few fruit flies to start my own.
I'm not sure who specifically grows them, if it's like an individual, because I know the department has like communal spaces where they grow like crickets and stuff, and I'm not sure if the fruit flies are part of that.
Prof Kennel keeps her stocks in her lab. So I would ask her, Kennell, and the other Drosophilologist is Prof Pokrivka, Pokrywka. But I would talk to Prof Kennel first.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Just thought I'd ask since we talk a lot about spiders in here. All right, thank you.
Welcome.
Hey, Professor. I had a couple quick questions. Which I was the one that was asking about yesterday, but they're quick, so I figured I'll do it now.
Oh yeah. No.
It's the first one is just pretty straightforward. It's what exactly does it mean when we're saying like, oh, one's like an apex species? Because I know that was in the concept questions, and we also kind of talked about it a little bit here, or not the concept question, but the reading questions. Is that just like a high trophic level predator? Is that what that is?
It's the highest trophic level predator. Yeah.
Okay.
The apex predator is not being eaten by anything. It's the end of the food chain.
Perfect. And then this one was a bit more generalized, but it was also kind of on the homework because that's what I'm getting done today. But I was looking at it yesterday, and I kind of it was like the same deal with the last reading questions that this was on. I feel like there's a lot of overlap between like the types of questions that ecologists ask, and stuff like that, and I kind of get a little confused on how to go about that type of thing. Where I believe on the homework it was like, what is an example of a question an ecologist might ask about the environment if they focus on each level? Talking about like organismal and population ecology. How do you kind of go about that or think about a question like that? Because it seems like there's a bit of an emphasis on like how the ecologists ask questions, and I get a little bit confused on that.
So it's there is a lot of overlap. Exactly what you're talking about. There is gray areas in these questions, and sometimes questions have to involve multiple levels in their answering, right? So for instance, talking about jumping spiders, if you're talking about this organismal level, you can talk about how a single spider works on the ability to mate, like its fecundity and its ability to produce offspring. But in answering that question, you're going to wind up answering questions about population, right? You might answer questions about how that spider is interacting with another of its same species. And so let me open up this other presentation.
I have to run, so I'm going to leave you guys to it. Have a good weekend.
Take care.
Have a good weekend, Professor.
You too.